Every year, thousands of experts evaluate the status of animal, plant, algae, and fungi species around the world. Using a common language of assessment, they categorize each species' risk of extinction on the IUCN Red List. The Red List provides a barometer of life. And every year, the outlook gets worse. More than 31,000 species are currently threatened with extinction. Most because of human action. But human action can also reverse the Red List trend. So conservationists, governments, and communities around the world are joining forces, activating tried and tested IUCN tools in a coordinated effort to assess, plan, and act for wildlife. Together, we can save species from extinction. Together, we can win the fight for our planet's future. Together, we can reverse the red.
Reverse the Red is a global movement to reverse the negative trends shown in the IUCN Red Lists to protect biodiversity. I'm Jenny Gray, and I'm joining you from Melbourne in Australia, the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to recognise the role of First Nations people around the world in caring for country and pay my respect to elders past and present. At Glasgow, the wonderful Sir David Attenborough said, if working apart were a force powerful enough to destabilise our planet, surely working together we're powerful enough to save it. Today's webinar is a deep dive into this topic we're all keen to advance. How do you turn caring for wildlife, animals, species, plants into a social movement, an unstoppable call for action? Joining me are three passionate and charismatic people who have been making their life work to understand how you mobilize people. They have made it their mission to empower people and change behaviors. First of all, we have Dr. Judy Mann. Judy is passionate about marine conservation and has focused her career on helping people to care for the oceans. She's worked at the South African Association for Marine Biological Research in Durban since 1992, where she is currently the acting chief executive officer. Judy holds a PhD in culture and environmental learning. Judy is president-elect of the International Zoo Educators Association, commanding educators right around the globe in zoos and aquariums, and serves on the Council of the World Associations of Zoos and Aquariums. Dr. Margaret Otenyo is the National Coordinator of Wildlife Clubs of Kenya. She is also a board member of WildLife Kenya, the African Fund for Endangered Wildlife, the ELSA Conservation Trust, and is the vice chair for the IUC Commission on Education and Communications. Margaret holds a PhD in climate change and education for sustainable development and has vast experience in inspiring children and youth to take action for biodiversity and nature conservation. And finally, Dr. Liam Smith is the Director of Behaviour Works Australia, an applied behaviour change research unit based in Monash University's Sustainable Development Institution. Liam leads the research group with over 30 staff and a portfolio of over 500 behaviour change projects, conducted in collaboration with governments, industry, and non-government organisation partners. His research includes the formulation and breaking of habits, spillover between behaviours, and the nexus between systems and behaviour change. His research covers diverse topics, including health, environment, social inclusion, biosecurity, safety, and finance. You can see from those three introductions why I am super excited about tonight's talk, because today we really are going to explore social movements and how we get people excited and empowered. We also have a slightly different format. For those of you who have been to one of our webinars before, today's format is slightly different because we wanted to do a deeper dive into the topic. And so we've asked Liam to provide an overview on social movements through behavior change and through the behavioral lens, and in particular, how you can grow a social movement so people can act to support both the movement and their local biodiversity. Following Liam's talk, and he'll take about 25 minutes, half an hour, Margaret and Judy will each share a case study showing the power of including people in conservation outcomes. And thereafter, we're going to have a bit of time for your questions. So as you're listening to any of our three speakers, or even if you just are genuinely curious about how we can make a difference and change with climate change, please put your questions into the chat and I'll pick those up during the question and answer session. So with that brief introduction, Liam, I'm giving you the floor and saying over to you. Please help us understand some more about what it takes to start a social movement.
Thanks, Jenny. Really appreciate the introduction. I guess I'd also like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land that I speak to you from. It's the Wurundjeri people of the East Kulin Nation, also in the city of Melbourne, Australia. When Jenny asked me to give this talk, it actually caused me to do quite a bit of thinking, I guess. I lead a research unit that does a lot of work around understanding why people do the things they do and how we might encourage them to do them. But I guess when we think about a social movement, we're thinking about something much greater than that and a sequence of behaviours. So it led me down a few different paths of theory and of different disciplines, which I'll try and craft a narrative around it in order to get to the behavioural bit, which I'll end with. But I thought I'd put this quote up first. Probably many of you have seen this quote and find it quite inspirational. Comes from Margaret Mead, the well-known cultural anthropologist who really started quite a revolution in the 50s and 60s, and particularly around, I guess, women's sexual rights and the like. And she said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." And despite the fact that it's actually probably misattributed to her, she certainly was a member of a group that did do this. And I guess we really like this quote for a raft of reasons. One, it says that the people, like we saw in the intro, it's people that can lead the change. It doesn't have to be government or business or not-for-profits. It can be the people themselves that can do it. It also gives us a lot of purpose in the work we do. It makes us feel like that we were able to be able to make a much bigger difference than what we perhaps are seeing immediately. And I guess there are some really good examples of this, where we have seen individuals and the people around them make quite a big difference. So, Greta Thunberg, Rosa Parks, Nelson Mandela really have led, and the people around them have really led to make and change and shape the world in particular ways. And that's true both, I think, for what we would call social good, but actually it can happen the other way as well. People can, and around them can certainly do that. So there is good evidence to show that Margaret Mead, if she did indeed say that, that it can happen and that there are some great examples of it. But I guess one of the points I'd like to make is that most groups of thoughtful, committed citizens don't change the world. And we have a lot of those in all sorts of fields and disciplines that don't lead to outcomes and don't lead to movements and social change, significant social change. And so I guess in trying to understand how we might use behavioural science, or how we might understand how we can get change, and I guess increase the odds that the work we are doing may have more of an impact, I think it took me to the realms of sociology, to regulation theory a little bit, and indeed marketing, heavily in marketing. And so I'm going to draw on some of the ideas out of those different disciplines to try and think about how we might use them before talking about behaviour change, and specifically how behaviour change might help. So this is some work from a person called Albert. It's very old work. It's been around a long time, and it sort of says, a sociologist, and he says, you know, what type of social movement are you after? Because there's actually different types. You know, if in this particular matrix, on one axis he has who has changed, and it can be very few people, or it can be a lot of people, or how much change. It can be doing very few things in a limited way, through to doing everything in life really, really differently, to what he called radical change. And we see these different types of social movements. So, you know, while we all might aspire to revolutionary social movements, it's probably not, they probably don't happen very often. I put some people up there who had been responsible, arguably, for revolutionary social movements. But I think, largely speaking, we don't see the sort of that sort of change. In thinking about particularly biodiversity, perhaps what we're more after is more reformative social movements. So what that means is everyone's doing things a little bit differently, and the accumulation of those things may indeed lead to a good outcome. So that's a sociological view of the types of change that you might have. Many of you will be familiar with this. Roger's, oops, the back one. I don't know how to go back, actually. Yes, I do. So many would be familiar with Elliot Rogers' work from the 70s, talking about you know, how products enter a marketplace and how they share and spread, and ideas share and spread. And he names these groups, the innovators, the ones with the new ideas, the early adopters that sort of say, hey, that's a cool idea, I want to have a go, or try of that, or use that, that's a good idea. And then we have the early majority that followed by late majority and the laggards. Of particular note, there's this gap, I guess, between the early adopters and the early majority, where ideas often, or products, or concepts, or even behaviours can stall. We often see them, you know, not jumping over the chasm. And so they sort of die out and don't ever get into the mainstream. So if we think about a social movement, which I do think these sorts of perspectives can be useful, we need to think about, how do we get across the chasm? How do we get the early majority interested in doing the things that the early adopters and the innovators, probably a lot of the people on this call, are doing for the purpose that we are interested in? This is a nice sort of cartoon that sort of shows some of the different typologies. But one of the things I wanted to point out was, how do we cross the chasm? And of course, there was the great Moore have written a whole book on how do you cross the chasm? How do you get the early adopters, or how do you get the early majority to start taking up an idea or a concept or a behaviour? And one of the key sort of principles here is that, you know, there has to be this perception of a bandwagon that they would like to join. So there's a movement that's starting to happen that they don't want to miss out on. And the motivations are a little bit different, perhaps, for those that are in the innovators or early adopters. Innovators are thinking of those new things. The early adopters are saying, wow, that's really brilliant, that's cool, we want to have a go and play with that. But the early majority think differently about an idea. So often we think about, how do we breach the chasm? Well, it's about creating the impression that there is some really strong movement that's growing quickly, and that there's a bandwagon that you don't want to miss out on. That's one of the really central points that Moore makes when he talks about how do we cross the chasm. Which also got me thinking randomly, and which, as I sometimes do, of a famous regulatory scholar by the name of Malcolm Sparrow, who says, pick important problems, fix them, and tell everybody. So but the context of this quote, which is really well known for people who are regulators, is that essentially you want people to feel like there is something much bigger than what's actually there. And so telling everybody is the magic ingredient here. It's about saying, hey, there's a problem here. We fixed it, and we fixed it particularly with a regulatory tool. So we've solved it by imposing the law typically, and now we're going to tell everybody about it, and we get the feeling like the law is much bigger than actually it really is. In the language of regulation, the bark is much bigger than the bite. So there's this idea of selling something much bigger than what it is. And interestingly, in thinking about this idea of making things look bigger, it's well known that in marketing fields that organizations often do what they call seed, things like YouTube hits. So a new ad might come out and they might pay for the first 1 million hits. So I Googled, if we increase YouTube hits, all these companies come up that will do it for you, right? So they are going to get on there and make something seem much bigger than it is, or make it seem like lots of people are doing the thing that you want them to, using the product or watching your content much more than others. So clearly there's a market for this, and clearly the marketers are doing this really well already, and perhaps we can learn quite a bit from them. So we've been around through a few different spaces now. We've been in marketing, we've been in regulation theory, and we've been in sociology. So now I want to turn to think more like a behavioural scientist. And I think about Margaret Mead's quote, and I think also about a matrix that we might create around that. So let's think about an idea of having two axes. One is the number of audiences, so the number of different types of people that exist in the world or in the group of people that we would like to change. And on the other axis, we think about the number of different behaviours that they might do as individuals or collectives. And when I think about those sorts of change, that change typology, then really, if we want to go from a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens to a radical movement, then we're going to have to get lots of audiences doing lots of things differently. So that from a behavioural perspective means there's lots of change that needs to happen. It doesn't happen very often. Occasionally things like COVID come about, and we do see the sort of change that you don't typically see, but COVID is really big exception. In fact, it's probably it led to the biggest change globally that behavioural scientists have ever seen, ever, in terms of the number of people and the rapidity of the change and the significance of the change. So these things do come along and they do exist, but they were born out of a very strong crisis. Of course, there are other ways. So if we think about less number of audiences, but still doing a lot of behaviours, that's maybe more in line with the redemptive type of movement. And then a more reformative movement might be, not that's still lots of people engaged, but they're not doing so much. So that's more that idea of lots of people doing a few things. And I think, and that this is really helpful because it helps break down the problem a little bit in terms of what are we actually really after in our social movement? We're after lots of people doing lots of things different, a few people doing a lot of things different, a lot of people doing a few things differently, which becomes important in a minute. And I think actually you could overlay Roger's curve on this to see, where they sit in terms of how they progress. So I guess I'm going to move this second part of my talk across to talk about I guess what I'd call some recommendations in light of all that we've learned, that we need to cross the chasm. Doing that is about essentially trying to make a behaviour seem much more, or movement seem much bigger than it is, in order to try and get some sort of a restorative social movement. So putting all those together, what would I as a behavioural science think might be a good idea? And I think the first point probably is that any behaviour in line with your goal or your mission, in this case preserving biodiversity, is good. It's a good thing for anyone to do anything. And I think we might get a little bit pent up in encouraging specific behaviours and really wanting people to do X or Y, and that is still a good idea, and I'll get to that on the next slide. But really, an important point is that any behaviours are good. And the reason why I say that is because we learn about who we are and what we care about not only from our upbringing and from our attitudes and from how we're feeling, but also from what we're doing. So we actually observe ourselves acting, and then we can potentially reshape our own personal image. And this is a really important concept. So important, in fact, that Robert Cialdini, the well-known social psychologist, said this in his book on influence, which has been, sold 7 or 8 million copies. He says, it scares me enough that I'm rarely willing to sign a petition anymore, even for something, a position I support. Such an action has the potential to influence not only my future behavior, but also my self-image in ways I may not want. And once a person's self-image is altered, all sorts of subtle advantages become available to someone who wants to exploit that new image. It's a great quote from Bob Cialdini. It's essentially saying, by doing, I become a different person. And indeed, there are studies that show this quite consistently, that say, for example, if you put a coin in a homeless person's hat or cup, that you changes your self-image. And that change is still true, even if I give you the money to do it. So I say, hey, here's $1, please put that in the cup. But the act of doing it changes your self-perception and makes you more supportive of people who are homeless more generally, and potentially available and susceptible to do more behavior that are in line with that. So any behavior is good that is in line with your mission, I think, is the first point. But if you can only have limited time, or you really do want to focus on a high a behavior that's really going to make a difference straight away, then high impact and high likelihood behaviors are probably best. So things that when people do them, they will make a difference, and they are also quite likely to do. And I put likelihood in there deliberately, because so often when we see particularly governments thinking about or NGOs or whoever wants to make a difference, they only think about trying to get people to change behavior that's going to make a big difference. So high impact behaviors. If everyone did X, we would get a really good outcome. But the problem is some of those behaviors are really unlikely that people are not going to do them. So if we think about Australia, where one of the big challenges might be something like water use and consumption, probably true in several other countries where people are dialing from as well, a really pretty good behavior to help fix that would be to install a water tank in your home or in a local area. That's expensive. So it's actually quite low likelihood behavior. So it would solve the problem, high impact, but quite low likelihood. So the reason I've got this picture up is because this exercise of going through impact and likelihood was done by a city in the northern part of Australia, a city called Townsville, that was thinking about how do we get best reduced carbon footprint in households. And they went through this process of first saying, well, what behaviours can people do? And to help reduce energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions at the household level. And they came up with a list of 240 different things. And then they said, well, what's the impact of all those behaviors? How much of a difference would it make if they did those? And they used experts to find that out. And they also asked the question of how likely is it people would do it if we asked them, or if we gave them the opportunity. And doing that actually led to prioritizing the behavior of painting your roof white, or if you are building a new home, including a paler or white roof. This is an aerial shot from Google Maps that shows the city of Townsville. On the left-hand side, we see a new development, a new constructed area, and they all have white roofs. So clearly the focus on that behavior has been effective. And on the right-hand side, we have many more white roofs or pale roofs than were there before. The majority of those are pale colors, and that's because people have changed the color of their roof. So high impact, high likelihood behaviors are best if you can. But like I say, I still stand by my last slide, which says any behavior is good. The second kind of piece of behavioral thinking that I guess can help in terms of building a social movement is to make the behavior, whatever it is, seem common. And that's particularly to get the attention of the early majority. So, examples that I've got a couple here that show, examples of really good norming, essentially. So making a behavior seem common is what we would call norming. And this is the first picture here. It came from the Premier of the state in which we live when we had a curfew imposed due to COVID, and took a picture of one of the major roadways in the city of Melbourne at about 9 o'clock, which I think was when the curfew came in, and tweeted this and said thank you, essentially really norming the right behaviour, which is to not be on the roads. In an example of volunteering, this kind of language that nearly 6 million people volunteer through an organisation annually. They might not be through your organisation, in fact, they probably aren't. But the point really is that you're making this seem bigger and more common than it is. And again, with vaccination, we can use these sorts of numbers, either raw numbers or trends. Both of those work quite well to get the attention of the early majority. We know that the early majority pay attention to these things to say, oh, look, more and more people are getting vaccinated. And it doesn't matter. I know this is kind of up to date and shows us at where we are now. So the vast majority of Australians are vaccinated at the moment. But if we go back in time to when we weren't, you could use raw numbers to say, hey, 5 million people have had at least one dose. That's still a good sign. Or every day we're adding 2 or 3% of people getting a shot or something. So this kind of norming is really important for the early majority. The next point I'd probably make in terms of behavioural science is to think about how do we get from behaviour A to behaviour B. So the question might be, if you do sort of heed the advice about anything is good because we know that shapes how we see ourselves. The question is, how do we get from behaviour 1 to behaviour 2? And there are lots of pathways that seem to be quite effective at leading or mediating that relationship. So getting from one to the other. There's one in particular I want to draw out because a doctoral student of mine did several studies on this and was able to show quite clearly that the environmental identity was probably the biggest one in terms of how do you get from behaviour A to behaviour B. What environmental identity essentially is someone's self-perception of what type of person they are. So if I've done behaviour 1, which might be something very small, like putting a coin in someone homeless person's hat, or in environmental identity, it might be signing a petition for, greater protection of wildlife or something, which I might not see as a great act, but it does, as Cialdini said, make me vulnerable. And if someone was to say to me, hey, Liam, you must be a really good guy who cares about these issues, and thank you for signing the petition, or thank you for doing that initial act, you must be someone that really cares about it. Then that helps shape who I am and increases the likelihood that I'll do behaviour 2. So these kind of midpoint interventions that say, thank you, well done, you must be someone who really cares about this, seem to be really important to get to behaviour 2. The work that my student Nita Lauren did really looked at littering and pollution behaviours, or pollution reduction behaviours, and was able to show consistently in lots of studies that environmental identity was really key. And in fact, you can manipulate people's sense of being someone who cares about the environment, and that is quite effective at predisposing them to do behaviour 2. And I guess kind of the question is, where do you go with this ultimately? So if you can get from behaviour A to behaviour B and put through identity, and maybe you get to behaviour B and you think, well, what's behaviour C or D or E? Ultimately, where do we want to go if we really want social change or social movement or social, significant change on an issue we care about? Well, I think the answer is policy support. And the reason I say that is because, pressure that comes to politicians or to key decision makers from larger numbers of people or movements of people really can lead to change. And the reason I've got wind farms up here as an example is this is some research done by John Ferguson and a doctoral student of his, Noblet, who looked at two groups of people and how much they supported wind farm policy, so to have more wind farms in a local area. And the two groups of people were two groups of people that actually cared about the environment the same amount. So they scored similarly on issues around, does environment matter to me? Is it an important subject? The difference between the two, though, was that one group were doing more pro-environmental behaviour than the other. In other words, what that says is behaviour seems to be a bit of a magic ingredient in then fostering policy support. So if we think about this whole journey, do something, anything, it doesn't really matter so long as it's in line with what people care about. Congratulate them, thank them, tell them they're a good environmental citizen, give them behaviour B, thank them again, and then ultimately have a policy support outcome that you want to target at the end, and hopefully you'll get change. And ideally, across all of that, norm what you're doing. So make it clear that lots of people are growing in this movement, an increasing number, particularly people who are like the target audience, so people who are similar to target audiences or people who have normative power. So we saw in the example that they were all saying Ashton Kutcher has one. So clearly that was a driver for that particular behaviour. But you know, key normative people who matter can also be powerful. So I think I'm just on 25 minutes, but there are some, I guess, initial thoughts. I really welcome the discussion. I haven't gone into a lot of detail, I guess, around some of the particular projects we've done in some of these areas. So it's more conceptual, but I do understand we're going to hear two great examples of how social movements have started. So I really look forward to hearing those.
Thanks, Liam. And I don't know about everyone else, but I've taken pages of notes there. That was really, really useful. And I'm now going to get us to shift gear and into a practical example. And Margaret's going to share with us a real life story about how she's been going about starting a social movement. And that's a grassroots conservation movement. And so Margaret, over to you. And thank you so much, Liam.
Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, in the course of my work, I have come across and seen the impact of social movements, very many of them. But today, I really want to talk to you about the Wildlife Clubs of Kenya, which started as a social movement. I'm really excited to share with you about the Wildlife Clubs of Kenya and its formation. So the Wildlife Clubs of Kenya was started in the year 1968 by a group of 12 students from Kagumo High School, that is somewhere near Mount Kenya. And what happened is that these students had an opportunity to visit the Nairobi National Park. And it really touched them because the environmental educator at the Nairobi National Park taught them so many things, including threats to wildlife and habitat destruction, and quite a bit. And the kids really felt really touched by this. So when they went back to school, they asked their teacher, their biology teacher, what is it that we are going to do to make sure that our future generations are able to enjoy visiting the parks, are able to benefit from the presence of the wildlife, and that their habitat is protected. And the teacher went to the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources, the game department, and explained the concerns of the students. And together with a few other conservation organizations, they decided that that particular school would be able to visit the Nairobi National Park for free. But other organizations felt that surely we can do better than this. and they employed a coordinator to organize this particular activity. So within the first 2 months, after the formation of, after the desk had been put in place, 2 other schools came on board and said they also really wanted to go to the park for free, and they would like to also be able to do something for the environment to make sure that when they be adults, the same wildlife that they are enjoying will still be there, so that when they become policy makers, then they can make decisions which respects the wildlife and the habitat. So with those kind of sentiments, the Wildlife Clubs of Kenya was formed. The vision at that time was empowered Kenyans with conservation knowledge for sustainability, because they were thinking of not just the kids who were visiting the parks, but the future generations for this country. The mission of the Wildlife Clubs of Kenya is to provide conservation education to the youth and to support wildlife clubs through training, information sharing, and advocacy. So after the initial 2 schools, there was 5 schools, and the numbers just continued growing. And the motivation behind this was the government and the conservation organizations, international conservation organizations, felt that there was a need to create generations of Kenyans who love nature and who will take action for nature, to ensure that more young people take up careers in the various fields of conservation, to create pride in taking action for conservation, and to make schools models of conservation. So that is what was driving them at that time, that there was a necessity to share knowledge and stimulate interest in wildlife, as had been expressed by these students who had approached their teacher, and to create awareness about the economic, cultural, and aesthetic value of natural resources, so that the future generations and the generation at that time in 1969 could have a deep understanding of the need to conserve wildlife and other biodiversity for the benefit of the present and the future generations. So these are some of the things that made this movement really successful. And this was an identified need. The need was that the young people felt that it was important for them to play a role in the conservation of the country's wildlife and the habitat. There was a champion in terms of the 12 schools, the 12 students from that school who drove the whole agenda. And then the organizations managed to recruit a very passionate coordinator who made sure that the whole process took off the way they had anticipated. There was a specific target. The target was the schools in Kenya, both primary and secondary. Although over the years, this has grown to include colleges and the universities. There were borders. This was going to be about Kenya. It was going to be Wildlife Clubs of Kenya. And of course, there was support. The conservation organizations that formed, helped to support the formation of the Wildlife Clubs of Kenya offered space. The government, offered employees. I recall that, from my readings, that the African Wildlife Foundation really equipped the organization. They had the support. And there were benefits. All the students who joined the Wildlife Clubs of Kenya had the opportunity to visit the national parks, which are owned by the government, for free. They would visit free of charge, provided they played their role in ensuring that there is sustainability, and they took care of the habitat of the wild animals by planting trees, making sure that there was park cleanups, helping to eradicate things like invasive species. There was sustainability. As soon as the Wildlife Clubs of Kenya was formed, the organization decided to invest in youth hostels. And these youth hostels were situated in areas of conservation interest so that all the schools that visited these areas would be able to have affordable accommodation, but at the same time, the Wildlife Clubs of Kenya would be able to make a little money to keep it running. Replicability. Wildlife Clubs of Kenya became really, really successful in that other countries and other young people all over the world saw the role that the young people had taken and the work that the Wildlife Clubs of Kenya was undertaking, and decided that they wanted to do the same. So because of the Wildlife Clubs of Kenya, there was the formation of the Wildlife Clubs of Uganda, of Tanzania, of Seychelles, of Ghana, of Nigeria, Zambia, Malawi, Seychelles, and even the Wildlife Clubs of Mumbai. And so these are some of the things that really made the movement very, very strong and grow outside the country. And these other organizations exist to date. The most important thing that I wanted to say is that the Wildlife Clubs of Kenya inspired the formation of the wildlife clubs in other countries. The Wildlife Clubs of Kenya created potential workforce for conservation and tourism. And generally in Kenya, you'll find that there is basically a very high percentage of Kenyans who are informed about the importance of conservation. Diversified livelihood options in line with activities like beekeeping and all that. And this really helped to reduce the extraction and usage of wildlife and biodiversity. And this also resulted to reduced human-wildlife conflict. And apart from that, because the young people who visited the national parks, later when they became adults, took their families, stayed in the Wildlife Clubs of Kenya facilities, ended up creating a culture of youth tourism. And this has grown and actually has supported this country, especially at this time when international tourism has been almost at, it's really not there. So I also just, I would like to share with you some of the activities that the Wildlife Clubs of Kenya is engaged in and which has helped in the sustainability. As much as a social movement takes off, if there is no financial sustainability, then it's gonna collapse. So the Wildlife Clubs of Kenya has continued to develop and to expand accommodation facilities at a very, very low cost. But there are so many other activities. For example, we have teachers training workshops, youth workshops amongst the youth who are members. And now we have over 5,000 schools from the original one school who are leaders. So they have the leaders who they call the presidents of the school. And we invite them for training so that there's sustainability within the school setup. The next year and the year after, it continues every year. Park and beach cleanups, implementation of alternative energy sources, anti-poaching and desnaring campaigns. Those are some of the activities that the Wildlife Clubs of Kenya is involved in. The Wildlife Clubs of Kenya mobilizes actually the schools around the areas where members are tend to join after seeing what the member schools are doing. Like every year, we involve the children in a climate change campaigns. So they walk around the schools with placards and demonstrate that. A lot of activities, tree growing activities, production of seedlings, awareness, creation, and of late we even involve them in the recycling activities of the PET plastics. We do a lot of materials production to really make sure that we rope in many students. But apart from that, we've cascaded activities to homesteads. The communities like what they see the schools doing, and when we have activities in the schools, they are also welcome to come and learn. And as a result of that, we have got things like improved cooking stoves, things like beehives for honey production and for the protection of the forest resources. But apart from that, we also continue to connect young people to nature by transporting them and paying for them to go and visit areas of conservation interest. The young people are involved in tree planting, and when they see the trees that they have planted, really taking off and growing so well, it creates a lot of excitement to the young people, and this encourages even more kids to join the movement, to become members of the wildlife clubs of Kenya. So we make special arrangements with conservation areas like the Giraffe Center and take the students there so that they connect to wildlife, they appreciate them. And it's also a benefit of becoming a member of the wildlife clubs. It means that they will get an opportunity to get a close interaction with wildlife, and they really love this. So those are some of the things that the wildlife clubs of Kenya have done as a social movement. They've encouraged so many young people to come on board. And I keep praying that time is going to come that we'll have wildlife clubs of Africa so that all the countries in Africa can come together and protect the biodiversity and reverse the red. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Margaret and Meg. That's just incredible. And I hope you're going to get a chance to see some of the comments of just people overwhelmingly say how amazing to connect with the youth and how important that is. Now, Judy Mann is going to join us next to share what they've been doing around creating marine protected areas and raising awareness of how important our oceans are as well. And so over to you, Judy.
Thank you very much, Jenny, for this opportunity to share with you the launch of Africa's first Marine Protected Areas Day. And hello to everybody who's joining us from all over the world. And thank you so much, Meg. You told us about a really old movement that's made such an impact. I'm going to be talking to you today about a very new movement that only started this year. So firstly, what is a marine protected area or an NPA? A marine protected area is a part of the coastline or the ocean that is specially set aside for protection. We could call it an underwater national park. We're very familiar with these on land, but not many people know that we have these protected areas in the ocean. Research has shown, however, that marine protected areas need the support of people if they're going to succeed. So our challenge was to look at how do we get people to support the marine protected areas of South Africa. The first thing we did was to find out what people know about marine protected areas. We did some research in our aquarium at Ushaka SeaWorld, and we found that almost 80% of our visitors could not name a single marine protected area in our country. So that was a bit of a worry. of those that could name 1 or 2 marine protected areas or could describe an MPA, most of them used the word no. No fishing, no walking, no diving, no shell collecting. So we realized that we had a real challenge. Firstly, we were trying to create policy support and physical support for a concept that most people have never heard of. And for those that do know what one is, it's a largely negative, exclusion-based approach. So this was the challenge that we were faced in communicating about MPAs. The next thing that we realized is that we each view and wear invisible lenses. And so how we see the world is based on our culture, it's based on our upbringing, it's based on our environment, it's based on what we know, what we care about. And we had to realize that people look at MPAs through their own lenses. Some people view MPAs as the most amazing places to protect biodiversity. Other people view MPAs as a place that's excluding them from finding their food. So we had to be aware of this as we built our social movement. So what did we do? I think that all of us in the environmental world use special days for communication. And around the world, over 140 special environmental days exist. And research has shown that these environmental days really do raise awareness, and under certain circumstances, they can actually drive behavior. So we decided, let's start the very first MPA day. And this was a bit of a daunting task when we'd never started anything like this before, and we haven't ever heard of one being done anywhere in the world. The first thing we did was to get a group of creative and passionate people. So we created a team. Now, we needed that passion because we were missing one important ingredient, and that was a budget. So we had a budget of 0, but we had passion, and that made up for any lack of budget that we might have. We used people who are familiar with the environment and also people who are experts in communication. What did we do? Well, naturally, we started with social media. Seems to be a starting place for most social movements. We created Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook accounts, and we really built these up over the 3 or 4 months leading up to MPA Day on the 1st of August through lots and lots of content. We did quite a lot of mainstream media through print, broadcast, and online. And over those 3 months, we got over 5 million rands worth of media coverage, which might not sound like a huge amount, but considering we didn't have any budget, it was quite good. On MPA Day, we had a virtual tour of 4 of our marine protected areas. We had to do it virtually because we couldn't actually visit the MPAs because of COVID regulations and lockdowns. And we had about 200 people attend these different events. We had the Two Oceans team down in Cape Town who took us to the MPAs down there. We had our team here at the aquarium, right the way up to the Isimangaliso Wetland Park. So we were actually able to take our attendees into the MPAs virtually. And this was done with such passion from all the teams around the coast. We did something that was new for me, a Twitter chat, and we reached about 2.7 million people. Now, if you think of the number of people that really don't know or have never heard about an MPA, the fact that we got MPA Day trending in South Africa, I think is quite an achievement. We had aquarium exhibits at the Two Oceans Aquarium and at Ushaka SeaWorld, and here we could engage with people one-on-one and really explain what a marine protected area is and why they're important. We had a photo competition because we realized we needed some photos. So we had a photo competition with some great prizes. And then we did school activities, both in a number of different schools, as well as on the rocky shores or on the beaches. We designed a number of resources. Some were specially designed for kids. And we've got Cyril the Coelacanth and various other children's books that we designed to introduce the story of some of the animals that live in MPAs. We put together a number of maps to show people where our MPAs were. And this was really important because people don't know or didn't know them. And then we have a website, which is a central resource. Then we have our MPA Day jingle.
Let's go to the beach today. We'll go dive and swim in the waves. All thanks to MPA. It's safe for you and me, and for the fish swimming in the sea. Now they live happily. All thanks to MPA.
And this was designed voluntarily by some students up at a music and drama school in Joburg. So what are some of the lessons we've learned from our brand new MPA Day? The first thing is to have a clear aim. Why? We firstly wanted to introduce people to what an MPA is, and then help to support the policy of having MPAs, get people to support the rules and regulations. The first thing we needed to do is find out what our audience knew and cared about, highlighting the benefits to people and nature. Often we highlight the benefits to nature only. We needed to focus on people in this one. Emphasize pride in our national marine heritage and conserving it for future generations. Empowering our audiences, we needed to give them something to do, and then using powerful images we found to be very useful, especially for an environment that most people can't see under the ocean. We had to build from the familiar to the unfamiliar, so we started with terrestrial protected areas, and then we took that into the marine environment, and capitalized on people's emotional connections to nature. People want to care for nature. How do we help them to do that? We tried to emphasize the positive, and especially using supportive language to counteract that word no that came up so often. Developing communication, especially for the youth, was really important, and Dr. Meg showed us that so clearly. And then to me, the most important one is working with partners. We could have never done this alone. And I think this applies to all of our conservation social movements. Working together with passionate partners is the key. You give each other support and we can do so much more together. So that is my very quick story on South Africa, Africa, and maybe the world's first MPA Day. And we hope that you'll be joining us next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. And super love the jingle, just awesome. Now we've got 5 minutes for Q&A, which is not terribly long, but I do have a couple of questions that have been coming through. And Liam, there was a lot of discussion about children. Both Megan and Judy have talked about engaging with children. Liam, from your point of view, how does that fit into some of the theory? And does anyone talk of that? Because obviously, not only do you engage the kids, but they ultimately become adults as well.
Yeah, great question. And look, the evidence is pretty clear that the kids that connect with nature as people that connect with nature as kids tend to turn into people that have stronger connection with nature as adults, and we know that connection with nature is predictive of pro-environmental behaviour, and although those relationships are really well established. So I think I can only laud programs that really do get the kids involved early, particularly where the involved is the doing, right? So I think all the things I said apply to kids as much as, perhaps even more so to kids than they do to adults, in how they see themselves and identity being a mediator from behaviour A to B to C to D. So I think, I guess I think it's a great place to start, and the evidence is really strong that it does indeed work.
And then one for you, Meg, in terms of once you've engaged the kids, no doubt the politicians follow. I don't know a single politician who won't show up for a great picture with lots of kids. Is that one of your ways in to get attention and talk to leaders?
Once in a while that works, but it's not a guarantee, because sometimes the politicians will not give you the time unless they are getting something in return. And the Wildlife Clubs of Kenya is actually a charity and a service. So we might not be able to, to compensate their transport or, the kind of things that they demand. But usually if it's within an area where an MP is, they actually get very excited, and they come on board and they will take photographs and say that it's a project that they have initiated within, their jurisdiction. They want to take over, which we don't mind, provided that, the kids are really being empowered and they can do a lot of stuff to make sure that our wildlife and biodiversity is conserved.
Fantastic. And Liam's reminding us that politicians are people too. If we can get them to make just one behavior, we get them on that journey with us. Judy, the question I'm getting from people is, how do they get involved? If people have been listening to this webinar and they want to be part of the Reverse the Red social movement, what are they going to have to do?
I think that there are a number of steps, and thank you for that question. We're actually starting the Reverse the Red social movement. It's just starting to take off. So the first things to do is to start having a look at our website, seeing what's happening there, starting to follow the hashtags Reverse the Red, which are going to be appearing across the board on all of the social media, watching what's happening on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, etc. And then we're going to be starting, I think, probably the first Reverse the Red Day, which is going to be happening next year to coincide with the biodiversity summit that's happening in Kuching in China. So just keep an eye out, and we'll be staying in touch. All of you, we have contact details, so we can be sharing information with all of you. And we're really looking forward to taking the Reverse the Red movement to a whole new level next year, based on the amazing insights of Liam, from the research, the experience of Meg, and from so many other partners. So we're looking forward to building our movements next year.
Thank you. I'd like everyone online, please join me in thanking these three great speakers. It's been absolutely riveting, and I could see that in that there was very few comments while everyone was listening to you. When I started talking, they started asking lots of questions, and we'll have a go at answering some of these for you as well. I would also like to remind you that we do have some more webinars next year. And so the webinars have been how we're reaching out to this wider community. The next three webinars that are coming up, we are going to be talking with some movie makers. So around the impact of environmental documentaries and the power of big storytelling. We've got some amazing producers out of Hollywood who are going to come and share with us some of the tricks and the impact of documentaries. We also have on our list to try and get some of the big environmental funds. We know that some of the wealthiest people on the planet are now putting billions of dollars into environmental funds. And while they're focusing on climate change, we really want them to think about reversing the red and biodiversity. And thirdly, we're going to be talking about national red lists for the more technical of those amongst us. And so, just taking a lesson out of what Liam was talking about, we have these webinars coming up over the next year. You're on our mailing list. Please join, and please bring 10 friends so that we can convince everyone this is the biggest movement around and we really want to be part of it. It also is going to be a really big year, the next year, for Reverse the Red. We have these webinars, we have the social movement starting, as Judy said, and we'll be calling attention to the most important COP that's happening, where they'll be setting targets for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And what we really need to make clear to every country's delegation that is going to the COP, we need to make it clear that species loss is not acceptable. Not only do we need to stop the trends, we need to reverse them. And with focus and passion and 8 billion people joining the most incredible social movement, taking small steps, taking impactful steps, but really just getting up and acting, we can be the first generation that stops the loss of biodiversity. Please join me thanking these three incredible speakers for sharing their lessons of hope, for telling us how we can make a difference, for encouraging us to actually take that first step, make that first behavioral change. I also want to thank the Smithsonian, who continue to be our hosts and continue to facilitate these webinars, and to all our amazing supporters. Thank you very much. I hope to see you next year. In the interim, I wish you all a very safe and very happy festive season, and I will see you early in the new year to talk about movies and big money. What's not to love? Thank you all very much.